What happens when the most guarded palace on earth becomes the setting of a secret no one was meant to witness? Not a televised ceremony, not a state event, but a hushed gathering in Buckingham's deepest halls where King Charles placed the palace's fate in the hands of William and Catherine. No trumpets, no balcony, only silence. A silence heavy with fear, betrayal, and the shadow of mortality. Why so sudden? Why now? For centuries, Buckingham Palace has stood not just as a residence but as a fortress of continuity. Its walls have absorbed wars, scandals, and the shifting tides of a restless nation, all while projecting an image of unshakable power to the outside world. To hold its keys is to wield the essence of monarchy itself. A weight that is more than ceremonial, more than symbolic. It is the transfer of destiny, the very heartbeat of the crown passing from one generation to another. On that night, away from the glare of the cameras, Charles made a move that no aide, no advisor, not even the closest confidants could have predicted. It was a choice that felt desperate, as if every tick of the clock carried him closer to an ending he could no longer ignore. The air inside those gilded corridors was thick with unease. Even the most seasoned courtiers, who had weathered decades of royal transitions, sensed something was different. This was not the calm precision of protocol, but the hurried pace of a man who seemed pressed by time itself. Charles, who had waited longer than any heir in history to take the throne, was now handing over Buckingham's keys as though they were slipping from his grasp faster than he could hold them. His reign, once imagined as a triumph of patience and endurance, now felt overshadowed by urgency and fragility. And there, standing before him, were William and Catherine. Their faces bore the weight of what was unfolding, a burden neither had been fully prepared to carry so soon. William's eyes, steady but unsettled, revealed the storm within a son witnessing not just his father's act of trust, but the confession of a king who no longer believed his own reign could endure. Catherine, calm on the surface, yet heavy with unspoken understanding, accepted the gesture with a quiet resolve that startled those watching. The moment was more than a ritual. It was a passage of power, one that cut through centuries of tradition with a swiftness that left even the strongest speechless. The ceremony itself was cloaked in secrecy, timed at the very edge of night when the city beyond Buckingham slept. No fanfare, no proclamation, just the soft clink of metal as the keys changed hands. Witnesses described the silence as suffocating, a silence that seemed almost deliberate, as though every word left unsaid carried a darker truth. What compelled Charles to move now, to act without the blessing of spectacle, without the approval of his consort, without the eyes of the world upon him? The answer was hidden in the shadows, in the tremble of his hands, in the unspoken urgency of a monarch who feared tomorrow might never come. And yet, for all its secrecy, one detail cut sharper than the rest. The absence of one figure loomed larger than the ceremony itself. A figure whose name was never spoken, whose presence was deliberately erased from history's page. Because, while William and Catherine received the keys, Queen Camilla was nowhere to be seen. But the silence of that night was not just about transfer, it was about omission. And the name not spoken, the face not present, revealed a fracture darker than the ceremony itself. In every royal ritual, the queen consort stands beside the king. Yet on this night, Camilla was nowhere to be found. Her absence was not an oversight, it was a strategy. The king's silence screamed louder than any proclamation. To exclude Camilla was to mark her as a threat. But what did Charles see in her shadow that forced him to turn instead to Catherine? For centuries, tradition has dictated that the queen consort is not simply a companion, but an emblem of unity in the monarchy. When the crown shifts, when the palace marks history's turning points, the consort is there standing firm, embodying loyalty and reinforcing the illusion of permanence. But on the night Charles handed over Buckingham's keys, that legacy was broken. The place reserved for the Queen at his side stood empty, and in that emptiness echoed the message that something within the royal house had fractured beyond repair. It was not neglect, it was deliberate. Camilla had fought longer and harder than anyone to claim her position within the monarchy. From the day Diana's shadow fell across her life, she endured years of being reviled as an intruder, branded as the other woman, condemned by headlines and whispered about in drawing rooms across Britain. She wore the shame, she carried the ridicule, and she clawed her way back into the fold, step by calculated step. By Charles's side, she rebuilt her public image, transforming scorn into reluctant acceptance, and eventually into the crown she once believed would never be hers. And yet, in the stillness of that night, all of it, every battle, every sacrifice, was erased with a single act of exclusion. For those within the palace walls, her absence was deafening. It was interpreted as a humiliation, a deliberate erasure that stripped her of legitimacy more harshly than any tabloid headline ever had. To not be included in that ceremony was to be written out of the story of succession, denied the chance to cement her role as Charles's partner in legacy. It was the cruelest cut, not dealt by the public who had mocked her for decades, but by the man she had fought for, the king whose crown she believed she shared. And what could have driven such a decision? Insiders whisper that Charles's fears had grown sharper in recent months. Whispers that Camilla's influence, once his shield, had become a liability, that he had begun to see her not as a stabilizing force, but as a reminder of the public mistrust he could never shake. By bypassing her in the most symbolic act of his reign, Charles was signaling something darker, that he knew the monarchy's survival could not rest on her shoulders. He was acknowledging, perhaps for the first time, that no matter the title she carried, the public would never fully accept her as the guardian of the crown's future. And so, in silence, he chose Catherine. It was Catherine who embodied the hope of continuity. It was Catherine who held the people's faith. It was Catherine who, in that moment, was being raised to a position Camilla could never claim. Yet, beneath the walls of Buckingham, another truth stirred, because Camilla's absence did not mean her defeat. To cast her aside so bluntly was to provoke a rage that would not stay hidden for long. But if Camilla was cast aside, another figure was being quietly elevated, transformed from future queen to the monarchy's secret cornerstone. She was never meant to be the star. The ordinary girl was dismissed as too common for the crown. Yet as Charles's trembling hand placed Buckingham's keys into Catherine's palm, courtiers swore they saw more than a gesture. They saw a coronation without a crown. Was this the moment Britain's people's queen became the monarchy's true savior? Catherine's journey had never been one of ease. From the moment she stepped into William's world, critics lined up to strip her down. Too middle class, they said. Too ordinary, too polished, too carefully rehearsed. They called her the girl who would crack under pressure, the wife who could never match Diana's enduring shadow. And yet, year after year, crisis after crisis, Catherine did not stumble. Where others faltered in scandal or arrogance, she remained steady, quiet in her resolve, unflinching in her devotion, unbroken in her dignity. Each trial reshaped her, not as the fragile outsider many expected, but as the very anchor holding the monarchy together. It was not long before the public began to notice what insiders could no longer deny. Polls revealed a simple but powerful truth. Catherine had surpassed every member of the royal family in respect and admiration. She became the face that softened the monarchy's edges, the presence that reassured a skeptical nation, the figure who reminded people of values long thought buried with Elizabeth. Her ability to balance tradition with the grace of modernity made her untouchable, even as storms raged around the family. To the public, she was no longer William's wife. She was the crown's most enduring hope. And Charles knew it. The king, who had spent decades longing for acceptance, came to a painful realization. It was Catherine, not himself, who held the loyalty of the people. He recognized in her the calm authority that even his own reign struggled to command. By handing her the keys, he was acknowledging what the world already whispered, that the monarchy's survival was tied less to him and more to her. Those keys, cold in her hand, were not just symbols of access. They were relics of destiny, the unspoken burden of continuity passed from one pair of trembling hands to another. Witnesses swore that in that moment, Catherine's role was reframed forever. She was no longer simply William's partner. She was the steadying force upon which the future of the monarchy now depended. She carried herself not as a woman overwhelmed by sudden power, but as someone who had quietly been preparing for this moment all along. Even without a crown upon her head, she bore the weight of one. Even without a throne beneath her, she stood as though history itself had claimed her. And yet beneath the reverence, danger brewed. For every silent coronation creates shadows of resentment. Every elevation leaves behind those who feel displaced, diminished, or betrayed. Catherine's rise was not only a blessing for the core monarchy, it was a curse for those who feared being erased by it. And no one felt that sting more bitterly than the woman who should have been there that night, watching the future unfold by Charles's side. Yet, every coronation, spoken or silent, leaves someone dethroned. And in the shadows of Catherine's rise, Camilla's fury was about to erupt. For decades, Camilla clawed her way to legitimacy, surviving scandal, ridicule, and comparison to Diana. But in one silent act, Charles reduced her reign to ashes. Behind her chamber doors, aides whispered of slamming doors and bitter tears. To be excluded from Buckingham's handover was not just an insult, it was annihilation. Camilla's entire identity had been constructed upon her place beside Charles. From the moment she was branded an interloper in Diana's world, she fought tooth and nail to rewrite her image. Every public appearance, every carefully measured word, every smile under hostile flashes of cameras was part of a long campaign to prove that she belonged at his side, not as an intruder, but as a partner in destiny. And when the crown was finally placed upon her head, it was meant to signal vindication, the end of whispers, the triumph of perseverance. Yet Charles's decision that night shattered it all. In the private handing over of Buckingham's keys, she had been erased. The betrayal cut deeper than any tabloid headline could. It wasn't the public scorn this time, it was her husband's silence. Witnesses spoke of her rage spilling through the corridors, a fury that rattled even the most hardened aides. Doors slammed, voices rose, tears fell. She felt humiliated, reduced to a ghost in a palace she had once believed was hers to command. To Camilla, this was not merely oversight, it was treachery. It was Charles acknowledging before the very people who once doubted her that she was not essential, that the monarchy's future could be secured without her. Her loyalists wasted no time framing the moment as a coup. In hushed corners they whispered that Catherine had orchestrated the handover, that the king had been manipulated into elevating her as the monarchy's savior. To them, it was not just a gesture of continuity, it was a carefully staged dethroning. The whispers spread fast, poisoning the air within Buckingham itself. For the first time, the staff found themselves split, some gravitating toward Catherine's steady calm, others clinging to Camilla out of loyalty and resentment. But Camilla was not a woman to fade into silence. For years she had endured storms that would have broken others, and she was determined that this humiliation would not be her end. Those close to her insist she began mapping her counterattack almost immediately. Who could she rally? What alliances could be forged? How could she remind the palace, and perhaps even Charles himself, that she was still queen, and not to be dismissed? Her pride, wounded as it was, burned hotter than ever, fueling her resolve to claw back what she believed was rightfully hers. Yet, as she plotted her next move, the greater truth became clear. The handover had not only fractured her marriage but split the palace itself into factions at war. On one side stood William and Catherine, the chosen heirs, their legitimacy solidified by Charles's gesture. On the other stood Camilla and her allies, furious and unwilling to accept her sudden descent into irrelevance. The battle lines had been drawn, and the palace, once united under Elizabeth's shadow, now braced itself for conflict. But if Camilla's exclusion sparked fury, the forgotten heirs of the monarchy saw the act as something even worse: erasure. As Catherine and William accepted the palace keys, whispers of betrayal echoed through Windsor's empty halls. Andrew, Beatrice, Eugenie, even Harry across the ocean, each felt the same sting. A monarchy narrowing its circle, erasing bloodlines, and declaring in silence who belonged and who did not. For some, it was exile. For others, it was war. For Prince Andrew, the humiliation was almost unbearable. Once the favored son, once the dashing naval officer paraded as Elizabeth's pride, he had fallen to the lowest depths of disgrace. Titles stripped, public life abandoned, his very presence now a stain on the monarchy. And yet, in the quiet recesses of his mind, he had believed there was still a chance for redemption, a sliver of space where he might remain relevant to the family's legacy. But as the keys passed into William and Catherine's hands, that hope disintegrated. Andrew was not simply sidelined, he was erased. The private fury he carried in those days was whispered of by staff, bitter rants, angry accusations, and sharp words aimed not only at Charles, but at the entire institution that had chosen to discard him so mercilessly. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, felt the blow in a different way. For years, they had endured the whispers of irrelevance, cast as ornamental royals without true power. Yet behind the scenes, they had been reassured, told by Charles, by aides, sometimes even by their grandmother that their place within the institution was still safe, that their loyalty would be rewarded. But now, with William and Catherine elevated in such a symbolic way, those quiet promises rang hollow. To them, the monarchy was no longer a family. It was becoming a fortress, guarded by only two names. The sisters, deeply hurt, turned to each other, confiding that they had been cut from the future they were born into. Their conversations grew sharper, their loyalty thinner, their disappointment transforming into a quiet resentment. Across the ocean, Harry and Meghan received the news like a wound reopening. To them, the private handover was confirmation of what they had long suspected, that they, and their children, were no longer part of the monarchy's story. The symbolism was devastating. Buckingham itself, the crown's fortress, was handed not to the broader family but to William and Catherine alone. Harry, once second in line to the throne, now stood as little more than a ghost, his children written out before they had even been given the chance to belong. Meghan wept in private, furious at the cruelty she saw in Charles's decision, while Harry's heart sank with the familiar sting of betrayal. In California, the sense of exile hardened into anger. Resentment spread like wildfire. It was not only the royals who felt displaced, but also their loyal aides, their long-serving allies, their networks of influence. Suddenly, a monarchy that had always been a web of interconnected bloodlines was reduced to a single axis: William and Catherine. To those left out, the message was unmistakable. They were not heirs, they were expendables. That exclusion burned, and with it came a dangerous thought. If they no longer had a place within the institution, then what did they owe to its survival? Soon, whispers began to circulate in the corridors of Windsor and Kensington. Leaks to the press, rumors that only insiders could know, fragments of truth wrapped in poison someone was speaking. Many suspected that the excluded royals, bitter and stripped of power, had begun to turn their silence into a weapon. The timing was too perfect, the stories too precise, and though none dared accuse openly, the suspicion alone deepened the fractures, leaving the palace vulnerable from within. The monarchy's circle was shrinking, and those forced outside it were no longer willing to watch in silence. Some were preparing to fight back, to remind the crown that bloodlines do not fade quietly. Retaliation was not a distant threat, it was already forming in whispers and shadows. The House of Windsor was no longer united, it was splintering into factions, each nursing wounds that would not heal. And yet, in this storm of betrayal, one figure stood unshaken, an unyielding guardian of Elizabeth's legacy who made Catherine's rise untouchable. Through scandal after scandal, one royal never faltered. Princess Anne, the steel of Elizabeth, reborn, the custodian of duty. On that night, as the keys passed, Anne's presence was no accident. She was there not as a witness, but as a shield. With Anne standing beside William and Catherine, the handover became unbreakable. To doubt them was to doubt Elizabeth's memory itself. Anne's life had been defined not by grandeur but by discipline. Where others in the royal family stumbled into controversy or indulgence, she carried herself with an unshakable sense of purpose. Duty was not a burden she reluctantly bore, it was the very marrow of her being. She had watched her mother's reign stretch across decades, shaped not by showmanship, but by endurance, by the ability to remain constant when the world threatened to fracture. That same steel ran through her veins, and on this night she carried it with her into Buckingham's hidden ceremony. Those close to Anne often recall her private reflections on Elizabeth's final years. In quiet moments, she had shared how her mother admired Catherine's grace under pressure, her ability to weather storms without flinching. Elizabeth, wise and unyielding, had once confided to Anne that Catherine possessed something rare, a steadiness that could outlast scandal, a dignity that would preserve the crown's fragile balance. Anne carried those words like a command, a final instruction from the monarch she revered most. So when Charles placed the keys into Catherine's hands, Anne knew she was not witnessing a rupture but fulfilling her mother's prophecy. To the courtiers present, her silent nod, her composed stance, gave the act legitimacy. If Anne, the daughter who embodied Elizabeth's legacy, stood firm with William and Catherine, then the transfer could not be dismissed as a whim or a conspiracy. It became continuity, not betrayal. It became duty, not desperation. For those who doubted, her presence closed the argument. The monarchy, as fractured as it appeared, was still standing on the foundations Elizabeth had built, but Anne's silence was not without message. To Camilla, it was a blade cloaked in dignity. She had no need for words, no need for confrontation. Her very stillness conveyed that resistance would be futile. The institution's future was secure in Catherine, not in Camilla. By standing with William and Catherine, Anne had quietly exiled the queen consort further than Charles's omission ever could. She had anchored the new center of power with the weight of her mother's memory, leaving no space for Camilla to claw her way back. For William, Anne's role was more than symbolic. In private, she assured him that he would not shoulder the crown's burden alone. She became his compass, his living reminder of Elizabeth's expectations, a silent guardian who would protect him from both internal betrayal and external doubt. In her, he found not only an aunt, but a mentor, a reassurance that the monarchy's legacy would not crumble on his watch. And yet, as steady as Anne stood, another reality brewed beyond the palace walls. For even the strongest fortress cannot contain the weight of secrets. The world outside was restless, suspicious, and waiting for the truth to emerge. The handover, meant to be silent and symbolic, was about to explode into public scrutiny. Because what happens in Buckingham never stays there, and within days, the world learns of the secret handover. It was meant to remain buried, but secrets in the palace always find their way out. Within days, headlines screamed, "Keys to Buckingham, handed to William and Catherine." The leak unleashed chaos. Was this abdication in disguise? Was Charles surrendering already? For the monarchy, secrecy became its most dangerous enemy. What was designed to be a quiet, symbolic transfer of trust now spiraled into a national storm. Newspapers across Britain and far beyond splashed the story across their front pages. Broadcasters dissected every rumor, every whispered detail, as if decoding the future of the monarchy itself. International commentators framed it as nothing less than the first steps of abdication. Was Charles stepping aside, not in name but in action? And if so, why had he done it behind closed doors? Questions multiplied faster than answers, leaving the palace in the most precarious position it had faced since the days of Diana's tragedy. Speculation quickly turned to the king's health. For months, whispers had circulated that Charles appeared frailer than ever, that time was pressing against him with ruthless speed. The handover of Buckingham's keys seemed, to many, a silent confession. Was this his way of preparing the nation for his absence? Was the crown slipping from his hands not by choice, but by necessity? Commentators debated openly whether the king's reign was already over in all but name. The palace attempted to regain control, but their own missteps made the storm even worse. Conflicting statements were issued, some denying any formal transfer of power, others admitting that William and Catherine were taking on greater responsibilities. This contradiction only deepened the crisis. To the public, it looked like deception. If Buckingham was secure, why the secrecy? If the king's reign was stable, why the handover at all? The confusion cast a long shadow, suggesting weakness at the very top. Behind the scenes, Camilla's loyalists seized the moment. Allies close to her allegedly began feeding counter-narratives to the press, painting Catherine not as savior, but as usurper. Stories surfaced claiming that Charles had been pressured, that Catherine's team had maneuvered to secure power for her, that the handover was less about continuity and more about an internal coup. Whether these whispers held truth or not, mattered little, the damage was done. Suddenly, Catherine's rise was viewed not just as a blessing but as a threat. She was celebrated by millions, yet simultaneously accused of undermining the monarchy she had sworn to protect. On social media, the storm raged even fiercer. Supporters flooded timelines declaring Catherine the true queen already, the modern face who could save the institution from its own decline. Opponents, however, warned of illegitimacy, branding her ascent as betrayal, calling her an opportunist who had quietly dethroned the queen consort. Digital battle lines were drawn, and for every word of praise, there was venom to match. The monarchy, already fragile, was being pulled apart in real time before the world's eyes. But as the fury escalated, a more personal truth was unfolding. Headlines, speculation, and whispers could not compare to the raw honesty that came from within the palace itself. Because in the midst of headlines and whispers, William's private words revealed a truth more heartbreaking than any rumor. Behind closed doors, the heir to the throne crumbled. With Buckingham's keys in his hands, William broke down, confessing the fear he had long buried. "Am I ready now?" he whispered, terrified that destiny had arrived too soon. For a man raised for the crown, the moment of truth still cuts like a blade. Those who stood close enough to hear him in those hours spoke of a man carrying the unbearable weight of both history and expectation. For years, William had appeared composed, polished, every gesture measured, every word weighed against the role that one day awaited him. But on this night, the facade cracked. The heir, groomed from childhood for kingship, admitted aloud the secret that haunted him. He did not feel ready. The weight of the crown, the magnitude of the throne, pressed down on him with suffocating force, leaving him trembling at the thought of what was to come. He confessed to his closest confidants the terror that had taken root in him. It was not only the burden of leadership, but the fear of losing the simple joys of his life, the intimacy of family dinners, the laughter of his children, the quiet moments that made him feel human. He had watched his father struggle, watched Charles's private life crushed beneath the endless grind of monarchy, and he feared history was about to repeat itself. Would he, too, be forced to sacrifice fatherhood for the crown? Would he wake up one day and realize the very thing he loved most in his family had been stolen by duty? In that fragile moment, it was Catherine who steadied him. She listened without judgment, her presence grounding him as it always had. Her words cut through the haze of doubt with clarity. "The people's faith is already yours." It was not a declaration, but a reminder. The nation had already chosen him, not by law, but by loyalty. His strength was not in being flawless, but in being human. And the public had embraced that long before he ever held the keys to Buckingham. To her, his readiness was not a question of perfection, but of heart. And in that, he had already surpassed the test. Bolstered by her calm conviction, William made a vow that night, one spoken with the rawness of a man who knew he could not run from fate. He swore that no matter the sacrifice, no matter the fear, he would protect the monarchy, not for himself, not even for his father, but for his children. For George, Charlotte, and Louis, he would safeguard the institution so that when their turn came, it would be an inheritance of stability, not chaos. His voice shook, but in that trembling was a resolve that hardened into destiny. Yet beneath his vow lay a chilling shadow. For even as William sought to find strength in his vulnerability, Charles's every gesture, every decision, carried the weight of a man preparing for an end he dared not speak aloud. What William feared might one day come was, in truth, already upon him. Because in truth, Charles's private ceremony was not preparation, it was farewell. When Charles handed over the keys, it was more than continuity. It was abdication, in silence. The king who waited a lifetime for the throne surrendered it in everything but name. his eyes filled with tears, as he turned to Catherine, the monarchy's true savior. Buckingham's gates closed behind him, echoing the end of his reign before the world even knew. Those who witnessed the moment spoke of his frailty, his voice trembling, his hands unsteady, but his intent painfully clear. He was not simply entrusting responsibility, he was relinquishing it. In Catherine, he saw the strength he no longer carried. The bridge between the legacy of Elizabeth and the uncertain tomorrow he feared he could not endure. In her presence, he recognized salvation for the institution he had fought so long to inherit. This was not a ceremony. It was a confession. A reign that began with triumph now yielded to survival. And yet, even as Catherine's rise was sealed, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising battles yet to come. The palace keys may have been handed over, but in their cold weight lay the crown's most haunting truth. What is passed in silence is always paid for in storms. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.